다음으로 추가 공지사항이 있어서 말씀드립니다. 드그루이터의 전자저널이 한국교육학술정보원의 대학 라이선스 사업으로 선정되어 전국 대학에서 전자저널을 무료로 이용할 수 있습니다. 추가로 저희가 국내 연구자들에게 오픈 액세스 저널의 논문 출판 비용 약 2,000유로를 지원을 해드리고 있습니다. 자세한 정보는 학술정보 서비스 포털인 리스 홈페이지를 방문하시면 지금 보시는 화면과 같이 공지사항이 있습니다. 대상 저널은 드그루이터의 하이브리드 저널 약 290여 종이며 지원 대상은 드그루이터 출판사의 저널에 오픈 액세스 논문 토글을 원하시는 국내 이용자 분들입니다. 지원 기간은 2022년 7월부터 2023년 6월까지이며 연간 30건 2,000유로 상당의 APC를 무료로 지원을 해드리고 있습니다. 신청하시는 방법은 리스 홈페이지 공지사항의 매뉴얼을 참조해 주시기 바랍니다. 그럼 본격적인 워크숍 시작에 앞서서 오늘 강연자이신 데이비드 슬리먼을 조금 더 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 데이비드 슬리먼은 30년 이상 연구, 저널, 학술 서적, 주요 참고 문헌을 출판한 경력이 있으며 현재는 드그루이터 출판사의 시니어 저널 매니저로 재직 중에 있습니다. 데이비드의 커리어를 살펴보면 재료과학, 물리학, 화학, 에너지, 환경과학 등 과학기술 분야의 전 세계 학술 전문가들과 함께 일해왔지만 이제는 사회과학과 인문학의 전문가들과 함께 일하는 즐거움도 느끼고 있다고 합니다. 또한 요즘은 취미로 영국 신문의 축구에 관한 기사를 쓰기도 하신다고 합니다. 그럼 지금부터 워크숍을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. David, over to you.
Yes, perfect. Yeah. David, we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Perfect.
I had to use that clever unmute button. Okay, good morning, everybody. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for being here. I'm told I speak too quickly when I get excited, and I'm already excited to be here today, so I'll try and control myself. Normally, I'd hold these presentations in person and encourage people to ask questions as we go along. But given the virtual format, I think it is better to run through the presentation and then try and answer any questions you have in the chat box, or even later on via social media or email. I'm happy to respond. I hope you find this session useful, but I do realize that there are people here who may have a great deal of understanding of the scientific publishing process. So I apologize to them in advance if I discuss things that they already know. Right, I sincerely hope that you find the presentation useful and that it helps you when you sit down to write your Nobel Prize winning piece of research. Don't mind if it's not published by De Gruyter, just make sure you mention us in your acceptance speech. I love my job and could talk about it for days, but unfortunately we don't have that long. I've published academic and scientific journals, books for 30 years. 20 years were with Elsevier, and I've worked for other publishing companies and even ran my own for a while. So let's get rid of my ugly face so you can concentrate on the slides, and we'll start with a few brief ones about De Gruyter. The main reason I joined De Gruyter was its rich history and its reputation for putting authors and customers first. It's also eager to embrace new technologies to provide a better service for those authors, librarians, reviewers, and editors. Now, I work with these excellent professionals to bring you hundreds of De Gruyter scientific journals, thousands of books and databases in a variety of formats with numerous partners. It's also still a family business, and it puts a great deal of emphasis on and importance on relationships. I also thought you might like to see some figures relating to both South Korea and your university. So here we can see the steady growth of research published in South Korea during the last 10 years. And we can also see the collaboration across 185 countries in 2021 alone. As far as your university is concerned, its growth in research is reflected in those figures. And at the bottom left here, you can see the number of citations, the number of references made to that published research over the years, which matches very similar growth to the amount of output. Now, the academic landscape, it might seem a bit silly, this slide, but please bear with me because it does have a serious point. So more than 2,200 years ago in China, the earliest woodblock printing could be traced. In Germany, in 1436, Johannes Gutenberg was recognized as the inventor of the printing press. In 1749, De Gruyter was formed. And in 1969, Gary Starkweather invented the laser printer in America. And in 1990, Tim Berners-Lee was accredited with inventing the World Wide Web. The serious point here is that over the centuries, great minds from all over the world have taken the technology and science behind the publishing industry and collaborated to improve it. And isn't this what the research publishing process is all about? We all stand on the shoulders of giants to move our fields forward so that those that follow us can say they stood on our shoulders. Now, before I go on, I recognize that representatives from a number of different research disciplines may be attending today. And so it's impossible to tailor this presentation to everyone's precise needs. But hopefully the content I prepared will make sense and be helpful for everyone in some way. Now, the research cycle itself is one I'm sure most people here are familiar with. Funding is dependent on publication, which drives more research, ultimately leading to new findings, which again need to be published. The publishing landscape you may not be as familiar with, but as you can see, De Gruyter's job is to make the process run smoothly, whether this is pre-publication by managing submissions and peer reviews, or producing and archiving the content while ensuring it reaches as wide an audience as possible. The figures involved across the whole research and science publishing industry each year are quite large. 30 million communications between editors, authors, and publishers. 1 billion downloads each year, and more than 40 million papers are now available, dating back to the early 19th century. 5,000 editors are appointed each year and 500 new journals launched. And a key figure here, more than 3 million submissions are made each year, with more than 50% of those being rejected. The growth of scholarly journals has been incredible, especially in the latter part of the last century. It seems strange that in 1789, one article suggested that there could be too many journals. Unbelievably, this figure is still growing by about 3% each year. But in many ways, the growth in the number of journals is driven by the amount of research and how science develops and evolves in different directions. In 2018, 2.6 million research articles were published in the 50,000 most important journals. That's one every 12 seconds. And each one takes an average of 40 minutes to read. So why is it important to write a good paper? Well, I think we've just seen that the competition out there is vast. And so before submitting your paper, you need to make sure it's an excellent reflection of your work and presented in the most professional way possible. This will help your chances of acceptance. It will make the lives of the editors and reviewers easier. And from those figures we saw there, editors and reviewers are already overloaded. If you frustrate or annoy editors and reviewers, you do make it easier for them to reject your paper. So give some consideration to your research and ask yourself the following questions. Is what you've done unique? Is it novel, new and interesting? Is it related to a current hot topic in your field? Have you checked the latest results or research in the field? Have you provided any solutions to difficult problems, and have any findings been verified? If necessary, have the appropriate controls been formed? And are your findings comprehensive, or is the narrative incomplete? So if all the answers are yes, then what we need next is a good, strong manuscript. And to do so, become a friend of the editors. They do get frustrated. Papers are often submitted that are clearly out of scope. Now, the aims and scope for all journals are on the journal homepage. Some authors fail to format their papers according to the guide for authors, which again can be found on the journal homepage. Some editors get frustrated if there are no suggested reviewers. It's not necessary, but it certainly will help. Equally, if there's no response to reviewers' comments and recommendations, that's annoying. That's a waste of people's time. Again, some people resubmit rejected manuscripts without even bothering to revise them. This is pointless. And an inadequate standard of English. Now, as an Englishman, I feel slightly guilty when I come to talk about language. Like most of my compatriots, I'm very bad at other languages, but I'm thankful that English is the main language of written science, even if it doesn't seem fair. However, given that it is so widely used, it's important to stress its correct use. Editors and reviewers do reject on the basis of poor English. And remember that journal editors and reviewers come from every country on earth. English isn't necessarily their first language either, but they still insist the papers are written correctly. Here you can see a quote from an editor. At the bottom there, you see, "I don't want to waste my time or the time of my reviewers if there are more than 5 grammatical errors in the abstract." Now that was written by a non-English speaking, non-native English speaking editor. So your article, your paper needs to be of value because it's the key to the door of your research community. And remember that your study is only meaningful if it is clearly understood, reproducible in some cases, depending on the subject, but that it is read and used. So what's the definition of a good, well-written academic paper? Well, it helps the reader easily appreciate, it helps them understand the significance of your work. It has a clear, useful, and exciting message. And it's presented and constructed in a logical manner. Preparation's key, and deciding what type of article you're going to write. Would it be a full article or original research article, a review paper, or maybe a shorter letter or short communication? Let's look at these differing types in a little more detail. Now, full article is a way of disseminating completed research findings. On average, and these are just averages, it's typically 8 to 10 pages long, would have about 5 figures and 25 to 30 references. The idea is that you draft your paper and then submit the paper to the appropriate journal. It's a really important part of the process when developing your research career. A review paper is different. It's a critical synthesis of a specific research topic. Often it's much more than 10 pages, many more figures, and about 80 references on average. More often than not, these will be commissioned by the journal editors themselves, and they're an excellent way of consolidating your research career. Short communications are usually limited in length. They're published for the quick dissemination of original and significant advances. So you're letting the community know something really novel, really new. There are dedicated short communication or journals letters in some fields as well, where authors can present their short preliminary findings and then go on to develop a full-length paper. So once you've decided on the type of article you wish to write, you have to consider selecting a journal. Now, these different papers are often cited and referenced in different ways over different periods of time. So here we see the impact factor and cite score. They're the measurements for citations or references to papers. And you see the review papers are often highly cited, more highly cited than regular articles. Short communications are very highly cited early on before dropping away over the years. I think the best piece of advice I ever heard is not to submit to a journal that you don't read yourself, one that you don't have a good feel for. So you want to give a great deal of consideration, again, to the aims and scope of the journal. Look at the aims and scope on the journal homepage to see whether your research matches what the journal is looking for. The type of manuscript you've written, a review, a letter, or an article. The specific subject area. I publish chemistry journals, and there are broad chemistry journals, but there are also more specific journals, like journals for, say, chemometrics. So you can target your research to precisely the right audience in some cases, or in many cases. What's the significance of your work? You want to consider the prestige and quality of the journal and the respect of those editors within the field. Increasingly, the production speed of the journal is important. You want to get your research out to your community as quickly as possible, and make sure that that community is the right one. Is that community associated with the right journal, and vice versa? And the coverage and distribution of the journal. It might not be the case that you need to publish in an international journal. A regional, a South Korean journal might suffice. Again, I'll go back to the guide for authors. It's really important that you read the guide for authors. Every journal has one. It will have been written by the editors, so you're ignoring it at your peril. So apply it even to the first draft of your paper. You know, you're looking at the layout, the citation how the citations are to be presented, the figures and table requirements. It will save you time in the long run, and it will also save the editor's time. And remember that the guide for authors can, like the aims and scope, can change, it can evolve. So even if you're not submitting to a journal for the first time, go back and have another look. It's worth it. Most articles should be constructed in this way, although it would be wise to take counsel from colleagues or study previously published papers in your field, because, as I've said, this presentation is fairly generic. When preparing the title, the abstract, and choosing keywords, bear in mind that these are the areas that will be used for indexing and therefore search engines. For the main body of the article, the introduction, the methods, results, and discussion, make sure that you never use more words than you actually need. Be concise, but be precise. Finally, ensure that you have a conclusion, acknowledgement, references, and include any supporting materials. So let's look at each section in turn. The title here, excuse me. The title tells your readers what the paper's all about. It's a bit like a newspaper headline. It doesn't tell the full story, but it should be sufficient to attract the reader's attention and to encourage them to read more. However, again, keep it concise, informative, and avoid any jargon or abbreviations that aren't recognized. Here are some real examples of titles before and after revision. Remember, the reader also has limited time available, so avoid using long, unnecessary titles. Be specific. Ask yourself the question, how would I search for this information? Put yourself in the position of the reader. I'm not going to go through each of these, but if you look at the bottom right here, this is actual criticism from an editor who says you must be specific. The English needs help. I haven't read the paper, but I suspect there's something special about these properties. So he recognizes, or she recognizes, that there's something important there, but the title itself it doesn't help point the director in the right direction. So the revised title you can see in green there. The abstract is like an advertisement for your article. Once again, be as brief and specific as possible. Now, keywords. Keywords are your manuscript's labels. Now, they're going to be used by those indexing and abstracting services, so avoid the use of abbreviations unless they're generally accepted, like DNA, for example. Refer back to the guide for authors for the journal you're submitting to, as it may have specific examples of acceptable and unacceptable abbreviations. Now, the introduction is your opportunity to convince the reader that you know why your work is useful, but don't confuse it with the results, discussion, or conclusion. What's the problem you're addressing? What are its main limitations? Are there any existing solutions? And importantly, really importantly, what do you hope to achieve? When writing up the methods, you should include detailed information so that the reader is able to replicate any experiments, for example, but don't forget to reference previously published procedures. You'd want those who read your work to do the same for you. The results section, this is where you'll present your essential or primary results, and you may use graphs or tables or photographs. The discussion section is where you can show how the results relate to the study's aims and hypotheses, how those findings relate to those of other studies. or as many possible interpretations of your findings that you can think of, and even the limitations of your study. Try not to use new results or terms that haven't been mentioned in the preceding text as well. And finally, don't ignore work that's been published that disagrees with yours. This is your opportunity to prove your case. So you confront that work, reference it properly, and convince the reader that you are right. Now, the conclusion shouldn't merely repeat the abstract. The abstract is an overview of the paper. The conclusion should be used to highlight what you have shown, what it means for the field, and describe applications and possible extensions of the work. Acknowledgements, well, you should acknowledge anyone who's assisted you with the work, but do ask their permission to be acknowledged. These people may be other researchers who have offered hands-on assistance, or someone who's provided help polishing the language or offered critical comments. Whatever you do, don't forget to include anyone who's provided funding and include any grant or reference numbers. Now, with the references, more mistakes are usually made with the references than any other part of the manuscript. I've known editors who will reject otherwise good papers because they're expected to work through and correct a full list of references. That's the author's job, not the editor's job. And of course, the idea is to make a friend of the editor, not a lifelong enemy. So cite the main scientific publication on which your work's based. Don't inflate the manuscript. Don't use too many references. Try not to use too many self-citations. Obviously, it might be needed if you're extending your work. You're writing a paper that's referencing previous work you've done, but don't cite yourself excessively. And the same goes for citations in the same region or the same university even. Try and be as broad and comprehensive as possible. You will very often have an international readership, so show that you've studied the research from around the world. And as I said earlier, about 25-30 references are appropriate for a full text article. So who's the first named author? Well, the first author will supervise the data analysis, the proper presentation, and interpret the results. They will put the paper together, and they will be the ones that submit to the journal. Co-authors will make intellectual contributions to the paper and its data interpretation if necessary. They'll review each paper draft, and they must be able to present the paper, its results, and defend any implications and discuss limitations as well. Try to avoid leaving out authors who should be included. This will only result in problems further down the line and could even cause a retraction of the paper. And don't gift authors. Someone making you coffee to help you keep writing late into the night isn't a co-author. A good cover letter gets you in the editor's door. This is your main opportunity to address the editor directly. Believe me, if you assist and convince them at this stage, you'll certainly be looked on more favorably. Let the editor know that you have approval from all of your co-authors and explain the importance of the research. If you can provide 3 or 4 suggested reviewers, this may also help, but try to choose experts from outside your own institute or country. From conversations I've had recently, I can assure you that this is increasingly appreciated by the editors. It won't guarantee publication, and they may not use those reviewers, but the gesture itself will guarantee you receive more attention than others, maybe even for your next submission. like elephants, editors do have good memories. And finally, before submission, ask a colleague to read your work and ask them to be critical. It's better to hear criticism from a friend or a colleague. Again, check, are all of the Guide for Authors requirements met? Are you sure the paper is appropriate for the journal you're submitting to? Take a last look at the aims and scope of the journal, just to be sure. Conduct a final check for language, even but with a native English speaker if possible, or an editing service. There are language editing services out there. Personally, I would say that you're in a great position. We have this wonderful tool called the internet that connects us all around the world, and I'm sure there are researchers in your area in the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, and other English-speaking nations that you can form a relationship with, maybe even add them as a co-author. As I say, that's the wonderful thing about the internet. Ensure that any literature you're citing is balanced, and are the results clear? Are the aims and purpose of the work clear? And finally, use a spell checker. Now, rejection. I'd just like to say a few words about rejection, something I've learned a little bit about over the years. First of all, don't take it personally, don't despair. Every researcher has a paper rejected at some point. Read the reviewer's comments, be self-critical, and if you decide to resubmit the paper to another journal, make sure you read that journal's Guide for Authors before doing so. I was once at a conference, not long ago, I was at a conference with an editor from a professor at Cambridge, and he was an 86-year-old man. We were having coffee, and he pointed to somebody on the far side of the room and said, he's just rejected a paper of mine. And I said, well, how can you possibly know? The peer review process is blind. Nobody can see who the author is. Nobody can see who the reviewers are. And he said, David, he said, I'm old enough to know this man's work. I know how he writes. He definitely rejected my paper. And I said, well, are you upset? And he said, well, how can I be upset? He said, I reject papers every day. If I was upset, it would make me a hypocrite. He said, I read his comments and I agreed with some of them. So I'll resubmit to another journal. And so it just goes to show that the best of people, the most experienced people still get rejected. So while it might be tempting to shut the curtains, turn out the lights and sob quietly to yourself, it's not the end of the world. Take a deep breath. Some papers are rejected with the comments asking for minor or major revisions. So take a pause, read the feedback, and then reread it. Ask a colleague to look at the feedback as well, just so that you know you're interpreting it correctly. Make a list of every comment made, and then methodically deal with each one in turn. When you write back, be polite, be considered, and be professional in what you write. Don't let your emotions take over. Be thorough. Don't ignore any comments you might disagree with. And ensure that your response is clear and well constructed. If you take your time, provide extra information or data if possible, as that might help, depending on what the reviewer's comments were. Address your letter to the editors and the reviewers, because the reviewers will want to see that you have reacted to their comments. And of course, make sure that any identification number associated with your paper is included in the correspondence. When you submit to another journal, if you're submitting to another journal, be honest, declare that the paper was rejected and the name of the journal. You could include the referee's reports, the reviewer's reports, but show how each comment's been addressed. and then explain why you're submitting to this new journal. Maybe it's more appropriate. Now, remember though, that when you resubmit to another journal, there's a good chance that it will end up on the desk of the original reviewer. Despite the big numbers we saw earlier, research communities can be quite small, and reviewers on one journal also review for other journals, or an editor of a journal might act as a reviewer for another journal. So if you ignore the original feedback, there's a chance that paper will be rejected again. Right, a few slides about ethics. I think it's important to talk about ethics, especially in academic publishing. Submitting your papers to journals in the correct way is extremely important, and it can make or break a career. I really must emphasize the annoyance and even outrage felt by editors and reviewers if someone is trying to cheat, because I'm afraid this is ultimately what being unethical is. It's cheating. And as I used to tell my kids, cheats always get caught. It's important that everyone knows exactly what is right and what is wrong, because the editors don't accept excuses. So unethical behavior could include the falsification of results, plagiarism, duplicate or multiple submissions, redundant publication, failure to acknowledge prior research and researchers, inappropriate identification of all co-authors, and any conflict of interest, of course. When we're talking about fabrication and falsification, fabrication is when someone makes up data and results and records them as being factual, as being true. Falsification is changing of information so that the research results are not accurately portrayed. The plagiarism is just taking someone else's ideas, their processes, results or words without giving credit to the original source. By taking the credit and rewards that are really due to others, it's nothing less than theft, and it eliminates the motivation of other scientists to generate new ideas. Now, whatever you do, don't send your submission to another journal before you have received a decision on your original submission, your initial submission. Competing journals do exchange information, and the editorial processes will be stopped immediately if multiple submissions of the same paper are made. The time wasted by editors and reviewers will not be appreciated, and it could damage a researcher's reputation. Finally, submitting a paper that's already been published elsewhere is not acceptable, unless it's in another language. But even then, reference should be made to the first published paper, and the editors should be made aware of the history of the paper and the research. The process of salami slicing is also not allowed. This is where multiple papers are created using research that could be published in one article or review. And finally, if all else fails, eat chocolate. This is an original piece of research, published research, that shows the correlation between chocolate consumption per capita in different countries and the number of Nobel laureates per 10 million population. So as you can see, the Swedes and the Swiss eat far more chocolate than the rest of us. Thank you very much for being here. As I said before, please feel free to contact me either by email or LinkedIn. Even if you don't have a question today, you might have a question in 6 months' time. I'm still happy to come back to you and try and assist you in any way I can. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, David.
네, 강연 잘 들으셨나요? 이제 Q&A 시간입니다. 질문 있으신 분은 이제 채팅창에 남겨주시고요. 모두가 볼 수 있도록 수신자를 모두로 설정해 주시기를 부탁드리겠습니다. 영어로 적어주시면은 강연자께서 보고 바로 답변 주실 수 있습니다.
David, can you read the question?
So I'm
From
just
chat?
going into chat now.
I think it's the very last one.
The cover letter to, yes,
Yeah.
because the cover edit, sorry, the cover letter to the editor won't be included in the paper that's sent to the reviewers. The reviewers will just receive the paper itself, but not the cover editor. Sorry, not the cover letter. So it's that would only be to the editor. The editor, of course, will see who the authors are, and the editor will know who the reviewers are. But you're right, it would be double blind as far as the authors and the reviewers are concerned. They can't see each other, but you can write to the editor. Sorry, what was the second part of this? Also give us tips for more accepted paper. I think I'd need to know exactly what more you needed. I mean, I would always counsel talking to somebody within your department who has had a paper published to get their feedback and learn from their experience as well. As I say, the paper is very this presentation is very generic in its content, but you know, I could advise you on submitting a paper to one of my peer-reviewed journals, because I know the personalities of the editors, and I know specifically what they're looking for and what makes them happy and what makes them annoyed. But I think the question is probably too general for me to answer properly. But if, again, as I said before, if you have something specific you want to raise with me, raise it, link up with me, go onto LinkedIn and send me a message, and I'll see whether I can help out more there.
네, 혹시 다른 질문 있으시면은 네, 채팅 박스에다가 남겨주시면 감사하겠습니다. 네, 그리고 대표적으로 그 다른 대학에서 진행했었던 그 대표적인 좀 질문 사항들을 말씀드리면은 SCI나 SSCI에 등재된 저널에 논문을 투고할 경우에 출판되기까지의 그런 시간이 어느 정도 걸리는지에 대해서 물어보시면은 그 SCI나 SSCI 등재 여부에 상관없이 어떤 논문이든 간에 출판되기까지는 걸리는 시간은 조금 모두 상이합니다. 에디터가 논문을 입수한 후에 이제 리뷰어들에게 리뷰를 해달라고 이제 보내야 하는데, 리뷰어가 리뷰를 하는 데에는 이제 걸리는 시간이 모두 다 다르기 때문에, 그 다음에 리뷰어의 인력 풀도 또 제한이 되어 있기 때문에 시간이 조금 오래 걸릴 수도 있습니다. 짧게는 한 2, 3주 정도고 길면은 몇 달까지도 걸릴 수가 있습니다. 또 이제 오픈 액세스 저널 출판과 일반 저널 출판의 차이점에 대해서 물어보시는 경우도 많은데, 오픈 액세스 저널은 구독료를 내지 않아도 모든 사람들이 볼 수 있는 저널입니다. 일반 저널은 일반적으로 연간 구독료를 지급을 하고 접속 권한을 획득을 해서 이제 논문만 볼 수 있는데, 이제 오픈 액세스 저널의 경우에는 논문에 투고하는 저자가 직접 논문 투고비를 내야 합니다. 하지만 일반적인 저널은 저자가 논문 투고비를 낼 필요는 없습니다. 아까 공지사항에서 말씀드렸던 것처럼 캐리스트에서 지원하는 대학 라이선스 사업의 일환으로 드그루이터 하이브리드 저널의 오픈 액세스 논문을 이제 제출하시면은 논문 출판 최종 단계에서 논문 투고비 2,000유로를 지원을 해드리고 있습니다. 네, 이 점도 같이 참고하셔가지고 많은 참여 부탁드리겠습니다. 또 저널 에디터에게 메일을 보냈는데 한참 동안 답이 오지 않을 경우에는 어떻게 해야 되는지에 대해서 많이 물어보셔가지고 이 부분에 대해서는 이 출판사 홈페이지에 들어가서 헬프데스크 등으로 메일을 보내주시면 될 것 같습니다. 어떤 저널의 경우에는 에디터는 몇 명에 불과한데 수천 장의 논문이 제출이 되기 때문에 리뷰하는 시간이 좀 오래 걸려서 에디터가 답변을 못 주는 경우가 많다고 합니다. 또 이제 학술지 등급을 이제 확인하는 방법에 대해서도 많은 질문을 주시는데, 학술지 등급을 확인하는 방법은 여러 가지가 있는데 임팩트 팩터나 사이트 스코어, 스코퍼스, 등재 여부, SSCI나 SCI 등재 여부 등으로 확인을 할 수가 있고, 이 같은 이런 등재 여부 등은 출판사의 저널 홈페이지에 들어가시면은 저널별로 이러한 정보를 확인하실 수가 있습니다. 네, 질문이 ANHCCI는 SCI나 SSCI에 비해서 투고 기간이 상대적으로 굉장히 길다고 알고 있는데, 네. 분야의 특징상 그런 거냐고 이렇게 질문을 주셨는데, 네, 분야의 특징상 조금 오래 걸리는 게 맞다고 합니다. 혹시 질문 있으시면은 편하게 남겨주시면은 될 것 같습니다.
David, I've got a, oh yeah, there's a question there already.
Okay.
And I've got another one for you from previous sessions after this one.
Well, I think the cover letter, sorry, let me show my screen again. You don't want to write a long cover letter. I'm not suggesting you write a four-page letter. It's a brief introduction to the editor. You're introducing yourself. Sorry, let me find it again. There we go. Yeah, so it's not intended to be a long letter. You're not writing a long love letter. You're writing the letter to introduce your article, and you can see here, and it'll be captured on the video as well. These are the key points that are of interest. So 5-6 paragraphs, short paragraphs. It's trying to explain to the editor, or you're explaining to the editor, not trying, you are explaining to the editor why you're submitting the article, why your research is important, and why it would appeal to the editor's readers, the journal's readers. As I say, if there's any possible conflict of interest in your work, you need to explain that and show if there are any special requirements. And it's also a good opportunity for you to say you have approval from all of your co-authors, so that there's no confusion going forward. But as I say, you don't need to be lengthy. If you can include some bullet pointed reviewers, maybe 2 or 3 potential reviewers within your field, that might help. Sometimes editors struggle to find reviewers, especially if it's a specific area of research. So even if they don't use the reviewer for your work now, they may use them in future. But as I said in my presentation, they'll remember that helpfulness from you, and it may benefit you in future. Does it help with my submission if I cite more reference in written English than non-English language? I think it depends on the audience for the journal, because as I said, there are some regional journals that they are specific to a country or a part of a country even. So you may not need to reference them if in English, if you're you may not need to reference the regional work. Having said that, it is published research, and we are living in an age where we're interconnected via the web. So if it's published, it's been out there, you can reference it in your own language. I would recommend referencing things in English, or maybe supplying a translation with the reference. So it's more easily understood by the readers, because as I said, the majority of people will be reading. It will be read in English. It will be written in English. So it's not a case of ignoring the original nationality or language. It's just obviously easier for somebody who's reading a whole text in English to read the reference in English as well. That's an interesting question about predatory journals. It's one of the frustrations about open access for me. I mean, and to Gruyter, in fact, every publishing company that I know of is quite happy with the philosophy of open access. But we used to work in a world, I'm old enough to remember we worked in a world that was, in a way, it was protected in a bubble. So the researchers, the publishers, the authors, the editors all lived in this bubble that nobody could get into. And open access came along, and it's a good thing. It means that research can be shared to everyone. Every person on the planet can read an open access paper. Unfortunately, in the world that we live in, there are human beings who try to make a quick buck, trying to make money. They're not interested in the science, and these people launch predatory journals. So they send out emails to try and get you to publish in their journal, and that's very frustrating for everybody, for the editors, for the authors. Obviously, I had a journal when I was at Elsevier. It was called Biosensors and Bioelectronics, and one day I got an email from a very annoyed Chinese researcher who said to me, how dare you charge me $1,500 to publish my paper in your journal? And I wrote back and I said, well, I don't know what you're talking about, because our open access charge was $3,000. I said, can you send me the email you've got? And he did. And it turned out that it was a predatory publisher. And because Biosensors and Bioelectronics was a top-ranked journal, they launched a journal called International Journal of Biosensors Bioelectronics. So they just included the words the International Journal of, and just to mislead people. So how can you recognize it? Well, I mean, most journals, I mentioned the 50,000 most recognized journals. Those are journals that are listed either in Scopus or by Clarivate for the impact factors and site scores. So those 50,000 journals go through a rigorous process. So if you see a journal that's got an impact factor or a site score, it doesn't matter whether it's a low or a high one, but no, they have qualified, they've been vetted. So I would look at those. Newer journals, of course, don't have a site score. I think it's important then to maybe do a bit of investigative work, investigate, find out who the publisher is. You know, again, with the web, you know, you'll see comments on the web if other people have been tricked by a predatory journal. So, but if the publisher, if a journal has been recently launched by, for example, de Gruyter or Elsevier or Taylor and Francis, Springer, Wiley, the big the recognized publishers, then you know it's a safe journal. Again, any publisher with a track record, with a history, you know, it's not just the bigger publishers. There are some very, very good small publishers out there. Societies, if it's a society journal, again, it's going to be a safe journal to publish in. But I'm afraid, yes, it would just be there would need to be a little bit of investigation there. If it's a new journal that's unrecognized, maybe safer to stay away if your investigations don't give you any information. Yeah, Buyong, I think it's always good to recommend a reviewer. It doesn't do any harm. It doesn't do any harm. It's a nice gesture, and you can write to the editor and say, you know, dear editor, I realize how difficult it is to find reviewers. Here's a suggested reviewer for this subject area, whether it be of use to you for my paper or for somebody else's paper. And it's just a nice way of building a relationship. It can't do any harm. You know, you don't write to the editor with a suggested reviewer saying, you must use this reviewer. You know, that won't help. But if you're just saying, I hope this helps, and whether you use the reviewer or not, for me, is obviously you are the editor, but it may be useful for somebody else. That just makes their lives easier, so it will be appreciated. As I said in my presentation, they may reject your paper anyway, but the next time you submit, they'll remember your name, and they'll be grateful that you know, you're working as part of the community. You're aware of the wider community, not just your little world, not just your research. Because that's what it is. It's a big community out there, even for the smallest of research areas. And it's you know, it's something I've loved about my job over the years, the fact that we're all interconnected, and it makes the world a smaller place.
네, 혹시 다른 질문 더 있으실까요? 네, 그러면은 네, 질문은 추후에 또 질문이 생기시면은 도서관 혹은 이제 저희 측으로 바로 연락을 주셔도 저희가 상세하게 안내해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 다시 한번 저희 워크숍에 참석해 주셔서 정말로 진심으로 감사하다는 말씀을 드립니다. 오늘 워크숍이 중앙대학교 모든 학우 및 교수진 여러분께 유용한 시간이 되었으면 좋겠습니다. 아까도 말씀드렸지만 캐리스의 대학 라이선스 사업으로 드그루이터 출판사의 전자저널이 모든 대학교 도서관 홈페이지를 통해서 공급이 되고 있습니다. 네, 많은 이용을 부탁드리고 싶습니다. 네, 감사합니다.